Good evening. I'm David Jacobson, Professor of Judaic Studies here at Brown, and I'd like to welcome you to the continuation of what is turning out to be a year-long discussion here at Brown on the 20th anniversary of the Oslo Peace Accord between Israelis and Palestinians in 1993. This evening's talk is sponsored by the Program in Judaic Studies, Hillel Middle East Studies, the Watson Institute, Brown Students for Israel, and J Street U Brown. Before I introduce our speaker, let me just make as a preliminary announcement that those students who were invited to meet with Gershon Baskin after the lecture, the plan is to meet next door in Solomon 003. And in fact, any students who would like to join us to talk about the question of how we talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on campus, you're all that's a student meeting that any student interested is invited to. The readers of the New York Times are well aware that unlike many less prestigious papers, the Times is very sparing in its use of banner headlines. It has to be, at least in the eyes of the editors, a very important history-making story to merit a headline that runs along the entire width of the newspaper. And one such banner headline, in fact, did appear on the front page of the New York Times on Tuesday, September 14th, 1993. It read, "Rabin and Arafat seal their accord as Clinton applauds brave gamble." The accord, what came to be known as the Oslo Peace Accord, and the leaders who sealed this accord were, of course, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Palestine Liberation Organization Chairman Yasser Arafat. In his speech celebrating the accord, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin declared, "We the soldiers who have returned from the battle stained with blood, we who have fought against you, the Palestinians, we say to you today in a loud and clear voice, enough of blood and tears, enough." And PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat responded, "Our two peoples are awaiting today this historic hope, and they want to give peace a real chance." Thomas Friedman, the author of the lead article on the event, reported that, quote, 3,000 witnesses watched in amazement. I would add from personal experience that many of us who heard their speeches and witnessed the famous handshake between Rabin and Arafat that was nudged and orchestrated by President Bill Clinton felt at that moment like the psalmist in the Hebrew Bible who declared, "Hayinu kecholmim," we thought we were dreaming. Others were much more doubtful that a true peace between the Palestinians and Israelis would emerge out of these accords, and some who were unwilling to contemplate territorial compromise between the two peoples were unreservedly opposed to the events of that day. 20 years after the signing of the Oslo Peace Accord, we know that it did not live up to its supporters' hopes, that the conflict between Jew and Arab over Israel-Palestine is alive and well, and that people on both sides are dying and will continue to die until it is resolved. Few have devoted so much of their lives to a lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians than Gershon Baskin. Dr. Baskin, the holder of a PhD in International Affairs from the University of Greenwich, immigrated from America to Israel as a young man and soon began to devote himself to bringing peace between Jews and Arabs. In 1988, he founded IPCRI, then known as the Israel-Palestine Center for Research and Information, but now renamed Israel-Palestine Creative Regional Initiatives. So it's still IPCRI, but it's under a new leadership and under a new name. But it's a think tank that has been involved in the study and attempts to bring peace between the two sides. During the premiership of Yitzhak Rabin, Gershon Baskin served as an advisor on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process to a secret team of intelligence officers established by Mr. Rabin, and he was a member of the Jerusalem Experts Committee established by the Israeli Prime Minister's office during the final status negotiations, then known as the final status negotiations, between Israelis and Palestinians in 2000-2001. He is a member of the steering committee of the Palestinian-Israeli Peace NGO Forum, a member of the board of ALMEP, which is the Alliance for Middle East Peace, a member of the editorial board of the Palestinian-Israeli Journal, a member of the board of One Voice, a grassroots organization that advocates a two-state solution to the conflict, and a member of the Israeli Council for Peace and Security. He has a regular column in the Jerusalem Post, and for 2 years, he was a radio host on the Israeli-Palestinian All for Peace radio station. Dr. Baskin has been awarded numerous prizes for his indefatigable efforts in the cause of peace. Gershom Baskin is best known recently for being the person who initiated and conducted the secret back-channel negotiations between Israel and Hamas that led to a prisoner exchange deal that made possible the release of Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit in 2011, after he was held in captivity for over 5 years. Dr. Baskin's book narrating his role in this deal has just been published in English translation by Toby Press under the title The Negotiator, Freeing Gilad Shalit from Hamas. There are flyers out in the hallway if you'd like to pick them up. Copies will be available in the Brown University bookstore, in other bookstores. Amazon.com has a book and Kindle edition now available of the book, and of course Barnes & Noble and other internet sites, as well as other bookstores. So it is my pleasure and honor to welcome Gershom Baskin back to Brown University to talk to us tonight on the 20th anniversary of the Oslo peace process. What went wrong? What are the prospects for peace between Israelis and Palestinians?
Good evening, everyone. Well, it's hard to talk about a failed process. Doesn't sound very optimistic, but I remain optimistic, and I'll try and end this evening with a message of hope as we try and understand what went wrong in this process. I'm going to begin with what David called the process, the Oslo Accords, or the Oslo Peace Accords, you said. We have not signed a peace accord with the Palestinians. The Oslo agreements were not peace agreements. It was a process. We agreed on a process of how we will make peace. We did not agree on peace. There was never a peace treaty between Israel and Palestine. Maybe that is some of the misunderstanding that created expectations that immediately after the signing of the Oslo Declaration of Principles on September 13th, 1993, that we would be in an era of peace. But essentially those documents, as we will see, set up a process for how we were supposed to arrive to peace after we resolved the issues that were in conflict. This is, of course, the story of the land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, the land that's sometimes called the land of Israel and sometimes called the land of Palestine, the land on which two peoples have emerged in their national movements and are fighting, killing, and willing to die to have a territorial expression of their identity. That is what it's about. This is a territorial conflict between two national movements over the same piece of territory that for most of the past more than 100 years in which we've been fighting and killing each other over the territory has been expressed around the notion of mutual non-recognition of the rights of the other. For many years, it was a non-recognition of the existence of the other as a people with national rights. As a national conflict over a piece of territory, anyone who's been neutral or somewhat neutral and come to analyze the conflict and propose solution has come up with the same solution each time. The first serious attempt was in 1936, 1937, with the Peel Commission, who proposed partition of the land into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state, so that each people could have a territorial expression of their identity. 10 years later, in November of 1947, the United Nations, the newborn United Nations, decided on the same proposal of partitioning the land between the Jews and the Arabs in a two-state solution. In 1947, called the Partition Plan, the map number 2 from the left, were the borders that were decided by the United Nations at that time, more or less an even split of the land between the Jews and the Arabs, each having their own state. But we also know that the Arab world rejected UN Resolution 181, as it was called, the Partition Plan, saying that the United Nations, the international community, had no right to divide their land and give it to others who did not belong there or who should not have a piece of it, believing that the decision of the United Nations was illegitimate. The Jews at that time, you'll remember, accepted the resolution reluctantly, one, because Jerusalem was left out, and 2, because the borders that were given the Jewish part of the state were seen somewhat indefensible. But yet, at the decision of the United Nations in November 1947, when the land was divided between Jews and Arabs on a more or less even split of 50-50, the Jews went to the streets and danced in celebration, because we were 2 years after the end of the Holocaust, when 1/3 of the Jewish people were exterminated by the Nazis. And the creation of the State of Israel by the international community was viewed as a moral imperative. And the Jews felt that this was the way to save the remaining 2/3 of the Jewish people in their new state, knowing that on the very next day they would be going to war. Map number 3 shows us what it looked like at the end of that war. At the end of the war in 1949, when Israel signed armistice agreements with its neighbors at the end of the war, it found itself in possession of not 50 or 51% of the land, but in possession of 78% of the land. And these remained the borders of Israel between 1949 and 1967. Palestinians refer to those borders as the June 4th, 1967 borders. They're more correctly noted as the armistice lines of 1949, also commonly called the Green Line. By the way, anyone know why it's called a Green Line? Yeah? Nice mythology, but that's not the real answer. Anyone else have an answer? But that is not the answer of why it's called the Green Line. It's called the Green Line because when they drew the maps on the armistice line, they used a green pen. And since that time, green lines on international maps designate armistice borders. Any war that has an armistice border will have a line drawn on the map in a green pen now. Anyone else know where there's another green line? It has nothing to do where there are trees and where there are no trees. Another green line in the world today. Anyone else know? Any guesses? There's a green line somewhere else. No, the line is called the DMZ, the demarcation zone. But there is another like Korea situation. Cyprus. Cyprus also has a green line for the same reason, armistice line. When we have the green line, and Israel is in the the pre-1967 borders, the division of the territory that is possessed by Israel is 78% of the land between the river and the sea. The other part of the land, commonly called the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, was occupied by Jordan in 1949. The Hashemite kingdom of Jordan annexed the territory of the West Bank of Judea and Samaria. It was an illegal occupation from 1949 until 1967. There were only 2 countries of the world that recognized the occupation of the West Bank of Jordan by the Hashemite kingdom. Anyone want to guess what 2 countries?
Great Britain and Pakistan.
That's right. We have a man who does know something.
But there is no such thing as an illegally occupied territory. It doesn't exist.
Okay, let's not argue now. We can argue during the questions and answers. I'll ask the questions now, and you can give the answers. Afterwards, you can ask the questions, and then we can argue. According to international law, that territory was occupied illegally by the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. It was annexed by Jordan. It was not recognized as legally owned by the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. We all know the story of June 1967, when in May 67, Egypt ordered the UN peacekeeping troops out of Sinai and closed the Straits of Tiran and formed a joint command with the Syrians and threatened war on Israel. And for a period of 3 weeks, during which time Israel was under the threat of war. For those of you who go back and read the newspapers of the day in Israel, the sense in Israel was that we were about to face annihilation, that Israel was being threatened by the Arab armies who had their marching orders and their plans to march on Tel Aviv and to kick the Jews into the sea. And on June 5th, 1967, in a preemptive strike, Israel knocked out the Egyptian and the Syrian air forces before they lifted off the ground. On day 2 of the war, appealing through the Americans to King Hussein of Jordan not to attack, King Hussein was hearing the reports from Egyptian radio, which were reporting that the Egyptian tanks were rolling into Tel Aviv, and he made the fatal mistake of bombing Jerusalem and bombing Tel Aviv. And Israel then retaliated and attacked the West Bank. And at the end of 6 days, Israel found itself in possession of all the territory between the river and the sea. in addition to the Golan Heights of Syria and the Sinai Desert of Egypt. In what was a miracle, a military victory perceived by many Israelis as nothing less than a miracle, we began a new chapter in the Israeli-Arab conflict. For the first time, Israel in possession of all the territory of Palestine, or the land of Israel, and all the Palestinians living in Palestine under Israeli rule or Israeli occupation. For those people in Israel who were God-fearing, who are religious, many perceived the Six-Day War as the beginning of the days of redemption. And for them, the territory of Judea and Samaria, which is for the Jewish people the cradle of our civilization. When we read the Torah, when we read the Old Testament on our fingers, walk through the pages of our history, it is in the valleys and the hilltops of Judea and Samaria that the stories take place, not on the beaches of Tel Aviv, with all due respect to the beaches of Tel Aviv. The story of our history is really in Judea and Samaria. This is the heartland of the land of Israel for the Jewish people, and those people who saw the Six-Day War victory as a message of God, from God, the beginning of redemption, believed that it was essential to go and fulfill God's commandments of settling the land of Israel, and thus we had the beginning of the settlement movement. In addition to those with the religious fervor who believed that they were following God's commandment and fulfilling God's will by settling the land of Israel, we also had many Israelis who believed that this was, territorially speaking, the way to prevent the emergence of a Palestinian state, which did not emerge in 1948, 1949, when the UN partitioned the land into two states. The Palestinian state never emerged, and there were people who understood that if Israel held on to these territories, that it was a way to prevent the eventual emergence of a Palestinian state. And there were those, particularly in the 1970s, and after the rise of the Likud in Israel to government, who saw this as a way of settling in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria as a way of providing Israel with security by preventing the establishment of the Palestinian state. But this was the new dynamic that existed, where we had an occupation of the Palestinian people under Israeli rule. Now, from 1967 until 1987, till the end of 1987, it took less than one division of the Israeli army to control the entire Palestinian population of millions in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. Less than one division of the Israeli army. But in late 1987, a road accident took place between an Israeli army vehicle and a Palestinian van carrying Palestinian workers from the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza, and the Palestinian workers were killed. And there were rumors that were spread that this was an intentional act of Israeli terrorism against Palestine, against Palestinians, and demonstrations rose in the Gaza Strip coming out of the Jabalia refugee camp. Thousands of people, led by women and children, throwing stones at the Israeli army, completely unequipped to deal with anything of this proportion. And within hours and days, the demonstrations spread across the Gaza Strip and into the West Bank. And we had what was then called the Intifada, the uprising. The word Intifada comes from the Arabic root nafada, which means to shake off. And if you can imagine taking an old dusty carpet and shaking it and seeing the dust rise from the carpet, that is nafada. And the connotation of nafada from Intifada was to shake off the Israeli occupation, to shake off the Palestinian leadership that kept the Israeli-Palestinian conflict dormant, because until this period of time, the official line of the Palestine National Movement, of the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was created in 1964, was no recognition of Israel, denial of Israel's right to exist, no acceptance of the notion of a two-state solution, and the belief that all the land between the river and the sea belonged to the Palestinian people, and the Jews had no right to be there. In 1976, I was a student in New York City. I went with two other students to see the PLO ambassador in New York City at the United Nations, Ambassador Terzi. And we appealed to him to recognize the state of Israel and accept the two-state solution. His response in 1976 was, "Over my dead body. We will never recognize the state of Israel. We will never accept the Jews' right to a state on our land, and you Jews should go back to where you came from." Well, in 1987, at the outrise of the Intifada, and the months that followed, the political leadership of the Intifada, which was called the United Leadership, the United Command of the Intifada, which was made up of the four main factions of the Palestinian National Movement, began putting out leaflets in the occupied territories in which they gave directives to the people on how to behave, how to protest against Israel. And they also put out political statements. Those political statements were not using the jargon and the language of the PLO, of non-recognition of Israel. They were talking about ending the Israeli occupation of 1967 and creating a Palestinian state next to Israel. When I began to read those leaflets and to hear what they were saying, I thought that we were on the verge of a political earthquake. We were about to have an eruption here of a political event which would change the face of the Middle East and enable for the first time a real engagement between Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs on the basis of mutual recognition. And in March of 1988, I got on my Vespa motorcycle and drove to the Dheisheh refugee camp south of Bethlehem, the largest refugee camp in the West Bank. And I drove into the refugee camp. There was a UN school there. And I was immediately approached by some young people who asked me in Arabic, "What are you doing here? Who are you?" And I said, "I'm an Israeli and I came to listen. I want to know what you're fighting about." And we stood in the parking lot of the refugee school for about 20 minutes. And then someone invited me to their home. And I spent the next 6 hours in Dheisheh listening, talking to people in a refugee camp. During those 6 hours that I was there, I didn't hear once what the PLO ambassador had told me about not recognizing Israel, and you Jews should go back to where you came from. Instead, they said, "We want the occupation to end. We want to establish a Palestinian state next to Israel. We want to live in peace." And when I understood that this was coming out of the refugee camps, I understood that soon the Palestinian National Movement would be changing its tone, and we would have the eventual emergence of a peace process. In November of 1988, the Palestinian National Movement convened in Algiers, and Yasser Arafat read a declaration of independence. That declaration was written by Mahmoud Darwish, the Palestinian national poet. Mahmoud Darwish had grown up in Israel. He was an Israeli Arab who left Israel and gave up his citizenship. But as an Israeli Arab, he studied in schools with the Israeli curriculum, and he learned the Israeli Declaration of Independence, drafted by a group of people and read by Ben-Gurion. That Israeli Declaration of Independence is a beautiful document which paragraph by paragraph says why Israel has a right to exist, from the historic right to the heritage to the connection to the land to the God-given divine right to have the land of Israel, to the UN resolution which gave us legitimacy and a legal basis for founding the state. And when Mahmoud Darwish wrote his Palestinian Declaration of Independence, he used the Israeli Declaration as a model. And that declaration, too, begins with the Palestinian people being born in the land of Palestine and its connection to the land and the history and the heritage and the rights, and concludes with the UN resolution 181 partitioning Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. And in the declaration it says, the foundation of a Jewish state and an Arab state in Palestine. Essentially, when the Palestinians transformed their national movement from one which demanded all the land between the river and the sea to accepting the 1967 borders, or the 1949 borders, whatever we want to call them, the Palestinians gave up 78% of their claims. In 1988, they had already recognized Israel within the armistice lines of 1949, and they demanded 22% of the land between the river and the sea in which they wanted to create their state. From 1988 until today, that remains the Palestinian position and the basis for peace on a two states for two peoples solution. Because this conflict is a conflict between two national movements over a piece of territory, and because the Palestinian demands are limited to 22% of the land between the river and the sea, we have a foundation on which we can build a peace agreement. And that's the understanding of which we went into Oslo. But let's see what happened. Israel and the Palestinians signed 6 agreements. None of them were peace agreements. They were all peace process agreements. Every single one of those agreements were breached by both sides. The purpose of the negotiations was to create a process in which Israel would withdraw from territory in the occupied territory, transfer it to the Palestinians. They would establish a self-governing authority and begin to take control. As they began to take control, Israel would make additional withdrawals from territory and transfer it to the Palestinian Authority. The purpose was to be able to get to permanent status negotiations after we had developed a period of trust, because we started from a basis of zero trust. So we would withdraw, they would take control of territory, they would demonstrate their ability to control the territory, we would withdraw from additional territory, they would take additional control, and we would develop trust to negotiate the difficult issues. All this would be based on UN Security Council Resolution 242, which set forth the principle of land for peace, the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war, as the resolution said. Resolution 242 never makes mention of Palestine or Palestinian rights. At best, it talks about the Palestinian issue as a refugee problem that needs to be resolved, yet that was the legal basis for the peace process and the notion of land for peace. The agreement said that once we had entered into permanent status negotiations, the issues that we would deal with are Palestinian statehood, the delineation of borders, security, settlements, refugees, etc. It set down what those issues are that needed to be negotiated. It also said that those negotiations would begin no later than the third year of a 5-year interim period. 1993, 1994, 95, 96, 97, 98. By 1999, we were supposed to be in permanent status after concluding negotiations of agreements on all the outstanding issues. But what was missing from the process? Oh, the process also, perhaps naively, perhaps ideologically, certainly the idea was good, set up the notion, the idea, the practice that we had to begin to cooperate. And because we were living in such a small piece of land, everything that concerned every aspect of life had to be done jointly. The Oslo agreements established 26 different joint committees in which Palestinians and Israelis would work together to build their future in two states with cooperation across those borders. That was the original dream. Not a dream of two states with walls and barbed wire fences, but two states with deep cooperation between them. And we set up all these committees, understanding the importance of security, a very detailed security network, subcommittees on every aspect of economic life, everything you can imagine. There were joint committees that were established. We also had a multilateral process that the whole world was involved in, with 5 working groups dealing with water, refugees, environment, economic development, arms control. This was a festival of nations coming together to help Israel and Palestine to make peace. One of the things that went wrong was that it was impossible to plan for worst-case scenarios. Who could have imagined that the Israeli prime minister would be assassinated by an Israeli Jew over giving up territory? If I had to point to a single moment of history when I say the peace process failed at that point, or that was the point of the beginning of the failure, it would be that evening in November of 1995 when Rabin was killed. But we had other events that took place as well, with increase in violence rather than decrease in violence, terrorism, bus bombings, that brought about questions of whether or not the Palestinians were able to control, whether or not they wanted to control. We began to establish borders, hard borders, physical borders between the two people. Before Oslo, Palestinians could travel freely from Gaza to Tel Aviv, from Ramallah to Netanya. People could go anywhere, they could work anywhere, they could get in their car and drive. And after Oslo, we suddenly found ourselves with borders and permit regimes and restrictions of movement. And people didn't understand what was going on the Palestinian side. This was supposed to be peace, or the beginning of peace. And now there were restrictions on their movement. They were being locked into small, controlled areas with Israeli soldiers preventing them from entering the areas that they used to enter before there was a peace process. One of the lacking elements of the peace process was that we didn't know where we were going. There was no stated end game. Ami Ayalon, who was one of the heads of the Shin Bet that appeared in the movie The Gatekeepers, he was an admiral from the Israeli Navy before. He was a commander, a captain of ships. Ami Ayalon always said as a captain, you can't steer a ship unless you know where it's going. Well, the ship of the Oslo peace process didn't know where it was going. It had no determined end game. In 1988, when I established IPCRI, the Israel-Palestine Center for Research and Information, after visiting the Dheisheh refugee camp, and I understood that the Palestinians had come to accept the idea of the existence of Israel and that we were emerging on a peace process between two peoples for two states, the idea of creating a joint Israeli-Palestinian institution to work on how to figure out how to resolve the conflict was made possible. It had never been done before because we began from the end game. When I brought together groups of Israeli and Palestinian experts, economists, Jerusalem experts, security experts, water experts, we started the discussion from the point that we said that the end game is two states for two people on the basis of the 67 borders, the establishment of a Palestinian state next to Israel. And once that was set and established as the guidelines, the terms of reference for the discussion, we were able to engage in serious discussions on how to get there. We were able to do what's called reverse engineering because we knew where we were heading. The question is, how do we get from here to there, knowing where there is? In the Oslo process, we didn't know that. And that created periods of great frustration because I wanted to actually jump to another slide. I'll come back to it. Because during the time of the Oslo peace process, Israel continued to build settlements in the territories occupied in 1967. The Palestinians didn't understand what was going on because from their understanding, when they agreed to recognize Israel in 78% of the land, they thought the remaining 22% was theirs. And yet Israel continued to build settlements after it was negotiating peace with the Palestinians, and it didn't make sense to them. If you're intending to give up this land, why are you building more settlements? But we signed 6 agreements, and nowhere in those agreements does it say that Israel can't build more settlements. There's not one line that says explicitly, Israel must cease its building of settlements in the territories. What it did say in one of the agreements is that neither party will take steps that will prejudge the outcome of the permanent status negotiations. The Palestinians thought that meant that Israel would not build more settlements. The Israelis said, we made peace with Egypt, we withdrew from Sinai, we removed settlements. In 2005, we withdrew from Gaza unilaterally, and we removed 21 settlements. The settlements don't prejudge the outcome of the permanent status negotiations, but from the Palestinian perspective, every day they opened their eyes in their backyard, they saw more Jewish homes on hilltops, more Israeli bypass roads, more Israeli control of the territories that they believe belongs to them and should be part of their state. And they thought that this was a breach of the agreement, although it wasn't, because the negotiators used the Kissingerian constructive ambiguity. Rather than finding a way to agree explicitly, they used language in which each side was able to understand the agreement as it wanted to, and then we had breaches. 6 agreements signed. All the agreements were breached by both parties. The problem was that once an agreement was breached, there was nothing to do with the breach. So the other party didn't think it would have the responsibility, the obligation to implement its part of the agreement. We could do a chicken and an egg and figure out who breached first and who breached more, but I will tell you quite honestly, it's very difficult to do that because there were almost more breaches of the agreements by both parties than parts of the agreements that were implemented. And it's difficult to say which breach was bigger, which was more substantive. The ultimate breach of this agreement was the use of violence. The first act of violence against one party by the other was a Jew who went into the mosque in Hebron and killed 20-something people praying on a Sukkot morning. Then there was subsequent Palestinian terrorism. But there were breaches that Israel did not withdraw from territories. I'll give you an example. The agreement said, the third agreement, which is called the Taba Agreement, the agreement for the implementation of the interim period, said that Israel would withdraw from all the territories and transfer them to the Palestinians with the exception of permanent status issue territories and specified military locations. That's the wording. Territories associated with permanent status, the Palestinians understood that meant settlements, and specified military locations, the Palestinians understood that meant military bases, high warning stations that the Israelis have. They got from one of the donors, I think it was the French actually, who gave them a GIS, computerized system, with digital maps. They calculated the total territory of all the settlements in the West Bank. What they did is they went to the most distant house in each settlement, went 50 meters beyond it and drew a perimeter and calculated the total land area that the settlement's footprint has in the West Bank. And they came up with a figure of about 1.5% at the time they were doing the permanent status negotiations. They said 1.5%, let's call it 10%. They said let's call it 5%. They got maps from the Israelis, aerial photographs of the West Bank. All the military locations on the aerial photographs were whited out by the Israelis so that they couldn't see what was in the military camps and bases. And they calculated all the territory occupied by the military camps and military sites. And they came up with a figure of about 1%, and they said, let's call it 5%. The Palestinians, before they began permanent status negotiations, expected to be in control of 90% of the West Bank before they began negotiating. The Israeli interpretation of the agreement was permanent status areas is the settlements. We are talking about the statutory boundaries of the settlements. That's between 20 and 30% of the West Bank. Statutory borders of a community are political decisions set by the government. They're not the area on which the settlements are built, they are in the areas that the settlements control. The statutory borders of the city of Ma'ale Adumim outside of Jerusalem contain land larger than the entire city of Ramallah and 26 villages around Ramallah. When it came to specified military locations, the Israelis said, we're not talking about military bases, we're talking about security zones. The entire Jordan Valley is a security zone. The entire line around the Green Line, a 5-kilometer perimeter around the Green Line, is a security zone. And here we have it 20 years after the signing of the Oslo Agreement, Israel remains in full control of 62% of the West Bank. We divided the West Bank into 3 kinds of territories: Area A, Area B, and Area C. Area A are the 5 Palestinian cities under full Palestinian control, sort of. Area B are the villages where most of the Palestinians live, is where the Palestinians have civilian control and Israel retains military control. And Area C under full Israeli military control. After the Second Intifada, when the Palestinians began blowing themselves up in Israeli cities and killing lots of Israelis, Israel reinvaded the territories and took full control of Area A, B, and C. And even today, when the Palestinians have their security forces working in Area A, Israel retains the right to enter into Area A freely as it pleases. So essentially, 100% of the territories are under Israeli security control. Palestinians have some kind of control over about 38% of the West Bank. That's after all these years. There were breaches here. There were breaches both sides in the use of violence and in the reneging of agreements of not to withdraw from territories. What happens when you don't when you don't implement your commitments under agreement is it makes negotiations moot. Why negotiate? The paper isn't worth anything. You make agreements, you take obligations upon yourself, and then you don't implement them. That's one of the crises that we face in this process today when we have negotiations going on again, is why negotiate? If we reach an agreement, the working assumption is that the other side has no intention of implementing what's going to be written in those agreements. Now, George W. Bush, when they issued the roadmap in 2003, got the idea that because there were so many breaches in the process, we need to make 2 adjustments to the process. And the Bush administration actually got this right. One, he said that progress from one phase to another in the peace process has to be based on progress. In other words, the parties have obligations. We don't move from one phase to another until the parties implement their obligations. Now, in order to make a determination of whether or not the parties have fulfilled their obligations, Bush suggested in the roadmap that we have a roadmap monitor. A third party, who in this case would be an American, would be a judge to determine if the parties are actually doing what they're supposed to do. Almost no one in the world knows this. But for a period of years, a 3-star US general from the US Air Force served as the roadmap monitor, General Paul Silva, one of the most intelligent people I ever met in Washington. His office was right next to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was a very powerful 3-star general, and almost no one knows that there was a roadmap monitor because they got part of the lesson, but they didn't understand it fully. His mission was opaque. His reports were not reported in public at all. They were only given to the decision makers and tossed in the garbage. If leaders are not accountable to their people, then the whole process of determining verification of implementation of agreements doesn't mean anything. So this is one of the key lessons learned in my mind, is that we need a third party. It will have to be an American. It will have to be a robust team and a mechanism that will be there to determine whether or not the parties are fulfilling their obligations, particularly the security obligations, but not only. There's going to have to be monitors on the ground who know the agreements and know what the parties are supposed to be doing, and there has to be a process of verification and transparent reporting so that people can be accountable for what they do or for what they don't do. And the other thing that we need are dispute resolution mechanisms on the ground. There was nothing to do when there were breaches because there was nothing to do with the disputes once they arose. A classic example is in early 1994, soon after the Palestinian Authority was established. Israel agreed that the ministers of the Palestinian Authority government would have a VIP status. They would be able to cross through the checkpoints without being stopped. A certain limited number of high-level Palestinian officials. Well, early one morning, a Palestinian minister was stopped by an Israeli sergeant at the border. He was demanded to get out of his car. He had to take off his clothes, his outer clothes. His briefcase was checked. The car was checked. This was all in violation of the agreement. Because there was no mechanism to deal with the dispute, you know where it got to? The desk of President Clinton. That's what happened with Israeli-Palestinian disputes. They all rose up to the highest level because there was no lower level able to deal with the disputes. That's another fundamental lesson learned from this process. We have to deal with disputes when they happen in real time at the lowest level possible. I'm going backwards. Yeah, sorry. We need mediators. That's what we have going on right now. We have a mediated process taking place between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I have to be quite honest. I was against the American mediation at this point, and I tried for 2 years to create a secret back channel between President Abbas and Prime Minister Netanyahu. My contention was that when there's an American in the room, the Israelis speak to the American, the Palestinians speak to the American, and the Israelis and the Palestinians don't speak to each other. And I thought it was necessary to have a secret direct back channel between the two parties if I could convince them to come together believing there was a basis enough for an agreement and that we would bring in the American mediator at the end to present bridging proposals and to provide the guarantees of the agreement. I still believe this is the best way to negotiate between Israelis and Palestinians. Secretary Kerry was dead set against it, and he prevented it, a secret direct back channel, when he heard that we were trying to make these arrangements. But there's a mediator at the table, and it's a good team of American mediators, and they know the material very well, and they've learned the lessons from the past, and they're very open to hearing from people like me and others, and they're receiving ideas. But one thing that I learned from Secretary of State James Baker, who was one of the best secretaries of state, who, if you recall, back in the 1990s, organized the coalition against Saddam Hussein and then organized the Madrid Peace Conference. James Baker explains his success by two elements. He says, in the 1990s, there was only one superpower in the world. It was the United States. And it wasn't only the United States military might. America was an economic superpower. That's not the case today. The second thing that James Baker said was that when he spoke, everyone knew he was speaking for the president. I'm not sure to what extent people in the region think that John Kerry is speaking for the president, and if he is speaking for the president, how important that is. The perception of American weakness in the Middle East is a detriment to the current peace process. Maybe not a reason for its failure, but it's certainly an element of weakness within the peace process now that America is perceived as weak and the president is perceived as weak. And John Kerry, very dedicated, very talented, very committed, and very intelligent, may not be able to pull it off without American power and American presidential power behind him. That we'll have to see. It's important that the public be involved, but it's also impossible to conduct Israeli-Palestinian negotiations in public. We have a political situation on the ground today where we have two leaders, Mahmoud Abbas and Benjamin Netanyahu, who don't have political parties supporting them. They're lone wolves today on the field. They cannot conduct public negotiations because they would spend their whole entire time negotiating with their own constituents inside their own political parties. Yet the ironic reality of Israeli and Palestinian public opinion today is when we do the research, in-depth research, public opinion research, not the telephone surveys, but when we present people in interviews a package of what an Israeli-Palestinian deal looks like, and we ask them, would you support it? We get between 60 to 70% of Israelis and Palestinians who say yes. We have 72 members of Knesset out of 120 that we've counted who would vote yes to this package for peace. Yet at the same time, a majority of Israelis and a majority of Palestinians don't believe it's possible. Why don't they believe it's possible? Because there's no partner for peace on the other side. We want it, they don't. And if you cross borders and listen to people on both sides, that's exactly what you hear. We want peace, they don't. Objectively speaking, anyone who looks at what's going on the ground can only come to the conclusion that the people are right. People are not stupid. What they see being implemented on the ground by both parties is enough indication that both parties are not partners for peace. They talk peace, but they don't make peace. Whether it be the continuation of the building of settlements by Israel or the continuation of incitement by the Palestinians, they prove almost on a daily basis that they're not partners for peace while declaring all the time that we want peace and the other guys don't. This may be an important point. We tend to negotiate in the Middle East like in the market, the Middle Eastern bazaar, the zero-sum game, trying to bargain each other down to positions that may not be sustainable. The best negotiation is when we put the cards on the table and we try to resolve the problem. Rather than competing over who's going to control Jerusalem, if we understand that Jerusalem is going to be shared and we work on developing models on how to do that together, rather than negotiating against each other, we will come up with a much more sustainable solution. I will tell you, in the 5 years plus of negotiations that I conducted with Hamas for the release of Gilad Shalit, at the end of the day, when those negotiations became official, and myself and my Palestinian counterpart from Hamas, the deputy foreign minister, were ping-ponging back and forth what seemed to me to be forever on very, very small concessions, I proposed to him that we work as a team, that he put his cards on the table, I put my cards on the table, and we agree before that we do that, we're going to shoot for the middle ground. The middle position between his and ours, between the red lines of Hamas and the red lines of Netanyahu, we would agree that the middle point between those demands are the agreed middle point. That's what we did, That's how we reached an agreement, because we decided that it was more important for us to solve the problem than to go on negotiating forever. That's a cooperative negotiation, and it was done between the worst possible enemies. It can be done when we're trying to achieve a much better situation, not a prisoner exchange, but an exchange of ideas for life. I want to move forward, and I want to open up for discussion. Peace has to pay. If the people don't get the benefits of peace, they don't want it. The Palestinian economy crashed after the peace process began because of the closures, because of the limitation of Palestinians working in Israel. Israel gained great advantage by the peace process. More foreign investment came into Israel than ever before. Israel opened up to the world and established diplomatic relations with countries that had cut diplomatic relations. The Palestinians suffered. Rather than their economy growing, it went in the opposite direction, and people said, if this is peace, I don't want it. Peace has to have a peace dividend. It has to go across both sides. We in Israel, who have $30,000+ a year, $30,000+ a year per capita income, as opposed to the Palestinians with $1,500 per year per capita, have no interest in poor neighbors. Poor neighbors are not a recipe for a sustainable peace. We want our neighbors to be prosperous. We want them to be successful. So why do we close our borders to their goods? I don't know. I don't get it. Palestinians, 80% of their imports come from Israel. We import almost nothing, and they produce goods that we could buy. But we have so many non-tariff barriers and so many obstacles that prevent their goods from getting into Israel. We're cutting off our nose despite our face. It's not in our interest not to have our Palestinians be prosperous, our neighbors prosperous. This has to be part of the formula, that they will benefit quickly, rapidly, that they will have employment, that they will have something to wake up for, that they will have a sense that they're building a new future, a new home. They're building their state. And believe me, Palestinians are very entrepreneurial. They're the most educated people in the Middle East. More university graduates than any other country in the region, with the exception of Israel. There's a great basis for rapid economic growth, and that has to be part of the peace process. Peace has to be civilized. After the peace process began, Rabin went to his chief of staff, Amnon Shachak, and said to the chief of staff, I want you to help us implement the peace process. And Shachak, who was an officer and a gentleman, turned to Rabin and said, excuse me, Mr. Prime Minister, we don't know how to do that. We're the army. You want us to plan for war? We're really good at that. You want us to plan for peace? We don't know how to do it. But at the end of the day, it was the army that was entrusted with the implementation of the peace process. Armies don't know how to implement peace. That's not what they're made for. Not only that, but the very same people who are responsible for turning authority over to the Palestinians, the civil authority, as it was called, the civil administration in the West Bank, most of them were settlers. They had no interest in the success of the process. So we had a built-in mechanism for failure in the implementation of the process, by the army implementing it, by people who were settlers responsible for transferring authority to Palestinians who had no interest in doing that. We need governmental ministries which are not military to implement peace processes. We need what I've been proposing for years, the establishment of a ministry of peace in Israel and a ministry of peace in Palestine, with a minister who sits in the prime minister's office, who would be responsible for implementing the non-military aspects of the peace agreement, ensuring that the ministers of tourism are cooperating, and the ministers of trade and industry, and the ministers of education, etc., etc. Personal relationships are essential. If the leaders don't like each other, it's really hard to move forward. This is a great Photoshop. I love this picture. We need work from the bottom up also. Peace has to be made between people and not only agreements signed. And this is also one of the failures of the peace process. After they negotiated the big agreement of the implementation of the process, the two chief negotiators, Uri Savir and Abu Ala, were sitting in the room. They had just had a drink with all the delegations to congratulate themselves. And suddenly one turned to the other and said, We forgot to give a role to the Norwegians. Oslo. The Norwegians were behind the whole process. We forgot to give them a role. So the two lead negotiators called two people on their team and told them to draft an annex to the agreement called People to People. The people-to-people peace process of Oslo was an afterthought, and that's how it was treated. It was never a serious part of the peace process, translating peace into something meaningful for people on the ground. That's how it was treated. That's how it was implemented. Those people in the non-governmental sector who tried to carry it out understood that we were an annex that was forgotten and added on afterwards. And that also has to be a central element of peacemaking, of thinking not only about the written agreement between the leaders, but how do we make this real? The real hard work of peace begins the day after the agreement is signed. Reaching the agreement is almost easy compared to what has to be done the next day. That has to be the focus. The idea of a peace process is to change the relationships between people. And here we have to change attitudes. We have to change deep hatred, fear, anger, and concepts of what it means, of teaching Palestinians to be free people who are responsible for themselves and teaching Israelis that they no longer control. All of this, of course, has to be based on security, because without security, there's nothing. And if the parties don't undertake the full responsibility of security, and that means working together, because there's no way of having security if they don't work together, then there won't be any agreement. We don't want third-party security forces, in my view, not NATO, not a multinational force, not UN troops. If the Israelis and the Palestinians don't take full responsibility for security, no third party is going to replace it. So the agreements have to be based on cooperation that's done today, not tomorrow when we're withdrawing from territory and taking more risks. Those systems have to be in place and tested and worked today before we have an agreement, because this is the process of building those understandings. We have maps. We know what the agreement looks like. This is a map of the Geneva Agreement. 4% territorial exchange. Israel will annex about 4% of the territories. That's about the total amount of land we have uninhabited adjacent to the Green Line that we can exchange for territories that we would annex. In annexing about 4% of the territories, we will accommodate between 75 to 80% of the settlers who will remain in Israel under Israeli sovereignty. 20 to 25% of the settlers will have to decide if they're coming home to Israel or they're moving to areas that will be annexed, or the third option is to apply for citizenship or permanent residency in the Palestinian state. And I know that sounds difficult, maybe absurd, but I tell you, if I were an Israeli negotiator at the table with the Palestinians, I would demand the right for Jews to live in the Palestinian state, even if no one's going to accept it. I would demand it as a right, because I take you back to the story of Judea and Samaria. This is part of the land of Israel. This is part of our heritage. We can't have it all, but the Palestinian state should not be Judenrein. Jews should have a right to live there. Salam Fayyad, the past Palestinian prime minister, told me that he accepts the idea, and he added that he would demand from Israel equality for Arabs in Israel, and he would ensure that by stating that Palestine will treat its Jewish minority exactly as Israel treats its Palestinian minority. And maybe that would be an incentive for full equal rights for Palestinian citizens of Israel. We know how it can be done in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, President Clinton set the parameters for Jerusalem. How many people have been in Jerusalem? A lot of people. You probably noticed that Jerusalem is the most segregated city in the world. There are no common areas in Jerusalem where Israelis and Palestinians live together. Every area is either Israeli or Palestinian. When I was a member of Barak's expert committee on Jerusalem, we took a huge aerial photograph of Jerusalem. We could see every building in the city, and we were able to determine which building is Palestinian, which building is Israeli. And we drew lines on the map separating Israeli sovereignty from Palestinian sovereignty. Clinton called it what's Arab to the Palestinians, what's Jewish to Israel. The idea is that sovereignty would be delineated on the map. Everyone would know under which flag they live. but the city would remain open. We don't want more walls and fences in Jerusalem. I live in Jerusalem. I love Jerusalem. Jerusalem will die if it's divided with barbed wire fences and the walls. The walls that we already built around Jerusalem created the law of unintended consequences. We built a wall to keep the Arabs out, and 60,000 Arabs moved back into the city because they were afraid they were going to lose their Jerusalem residency rights. Jerusalem has to be an open city, but it has to be the capitals of both countries. The biggest, most difficult part of Jerusalem is the Old City. Less than 1 square kilometer of territory, with 4 quarters, the Jewish quarter, the Muslim quarter, the Armenian quarter, and the Christian quarter. We could take the Clinton parameters into the Old City and say where Jews live, which is the Jewish quarter, would be under Israeli sovereignty, and the 3 other quarters would be under Palestinian sovereignty. Or the University of Windsor in Canada had a very detailed Old City of Jerusalem project in which they brought together Jerusalem experts from Israel, Palestine, and the rest of the world. And they came up with a model which could commonly be called a condominium model. There would be a board of residents of the city who would hire a management company, a professional international management company, that would manage the Old City on behalf of its residents. And like in a condominium, you pay your taxes to the board, and the board hires a company, and the company runs the building. Usually they do a better job than the residents themselves, because they're professionals at doing it. So that's also an acceptable model. We, of course, have the biggest problem, which is right there, the Temple Mount. For us Jews, right there, the spot of the first temple and the second temple, the Dome of the Rock, sitting on top of the rock, which we believe, according to Jewish tradition, the place where Abraham brought Isaac for sacrifice and was replaced by the lamb, by the angel. The place where Muslims believe that Ibrahim brought Ishmael for sacrifice and was replaced by the angel. The place where for us the Holy Temple was built, the holiest place in the world. Every place in the world where Jews pray, we turn toward Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, when we pray, we turn toward the Temple Mount. And yet, on our holiest place, our rabbis tell us we shouldn't go. Shouldn't go up there. Why? Why shouldn't Jews go up to the Temple Mount? What do the rabbis say? Anyone know? Yeah? One of the students here, yeah.
You might accidentally walk on the Holy of Holies.
The Holy of Holies. What's the Holy of Holies?
That's a place where the ark, that's the place where only the highest priests would go one day.
Right. It's the place where they believe that on the final moments of Yom Kippur, and the Ne'ilah service of Yom Kippur, God would actually descend on the mount, and the high priest would face God and ask for forgiveness. And because we don't know where the Holy of Holies is, we shouldn't desecrate the mount until the Messiah comes. This is the ultimate political fudge clause. When the Messiah comes, he or she can deal with the issue of sovereignty. Until then, it's actually okay that the Muslims continue to control it, because we can't even go there. We go down below at the Western Wall to pray, and that's accepted. Even though, I don't know if you know this, the Muslims call the Western Wall Al-Buraq. Al-Buraq, for those of you who know Arabic and Hebrew, Al-Buraq, Al-Baruch. The blessed, it's named for the steed which carried Muhammad from Mecca to Jerusalem. The steed was called Al-Buraq. When you go to the Western Wall, to the southernmost corner of the Western Wall, you will see in the cornerstone holes that go through the stone in the corner. According to the Muslims, that's the place where Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, tied Al-Buraq when he ascended to heaven to receive the Quran. Jerusalem was the first direction of prayer for Muslims before it was changed to Mecca. According to Islam, one of the 5 pillars of Islam, Hajj, pilgrimage, you do not fulfill your obligations of Hajj until you visit Jerusalem. It's Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem. Jerusalem is referred to twice in the Quran and the Hadith as Beit al-Maqdas in Arabic. Sound familiar? Beit al-Maqdas, what does it sound like? Beit HaMikdash, the temple. That's how they refer to it in the Quran, Beit al-Maqdas. And it's also called the distant mosque, the place that Muhammad went on his night journey to ascend to heaven to receive the Quran. So we have a solution for the holy places as well. where they continue to control above and we continue to control below, and we all agree that we won't dig, tunnel, construct without mutual agreement. Refugees, very briefly, President Abbas has recognized that there can be no major return of refugees to Israel and at the same time accept the two-state solution. There's a fundamental contradiction between the two. The Palestinian refugee issue is going to have to be resolved within the framework of the Palestinian state. The largest community of refugees in the world, Palestinian refugees, are in Jordan and in the occupied territories. The Jordanians are going to stay there. The Palestinian refugees need to be supported in terms of getting out of slum life conditions with money and new housing and better jobs and better education. The worst condition of any Palestinian refugees are those in Syria, who have now become refugees once again against that horrible regime there that's killing its people. 500,000 Palestinian refugees are on the run again, and they need a humanitarian solution. The best thing would be if Israel tomorrow would announce that it has no problem with the Palestinians building 2 or 3 new cities in the West Bank for Palestinian refugees from Syria. Answering a humanitarian need, the world would raise the funds to support it. And we would resolve one of the most burning aspects of the Palestinian refugee problem through the back door. They would be going home to their state. They would be going home to live in dignity. They would end their life of refuge. They would save themselves and, of course, the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, 350,000 people who have almost no rights. They, too, must choose their future. Most of them may declare that they want to go back to Israel, but they wouldn't want to live in the state of Israel under Israeli sovereignty. So they will have other options, including places like Canada. During the talks on refugees, the Canadians said that they would accept 100,000 Palestinian refugees. And other countries said that they would accept refugees, and every Palestinian will always have the right to go back to Palestine. The last problem, and with this I'll end and we'll open for discussion, is Gaza. People say, how can we do it? There are 2 separate Palestinian regimes. What do you do with Hamas? We have nothing to negotiate with Hamas about. Nothing. They don't want to negotiate with us. We don't want to negotiate with them. They're committed to our destruction. We have nothing to say to them. But we also have no territorial dispute with Gaza. We withdrew from Gaza. So in a peace agreement, it would state that Gaza is part of the Palestinian state, but it will only be implemented there when the regime that controls Gaza agrees to the terms of the agreement. And then, for the first time, we will be empowering the moderates. What did we do when we left Gaza? Sharon declared, we're leaving Gaza. We're not negotiating with the Palestinians because there's no one to negotiate with. They're not partners for peace. Mahmoud Abbas, he called a chick without feathers. What was the Palestinian narrative of the withdrawal, the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, the disengagement as we called it? Who won the battle? What was the narrative? The narrative was that Israel was forced out of Gaza because of military attacks against the soldiers and the settlers. Terrorism. What they call mukawma. Hitnagdut. Rejectionism. They hit us and they hit us and they hit us, and we went running. Just as we ran away from southern Lebanon and empowered Hezbollah, we ran out of Gaza, and Hamas was elected as the victors because they said 15 years the PLO was negotiating with Israel and didn't get anything. We hit the Israelis, and they went running. That's the only language the Israelis understand. So now if we tell the Palestinians that Gaza is part of the Palestinian state, that they can achieve their freedom, their liberation, their prosperity, their free movement, their being part of the Palestinian state, only if the regime that controls Gaza accepts the terms of the agreement, they will overthrow Hamas. Hamas is at its lowest point ever. It has lost the support of the people. It never had a majority of support. Today, it's estimated around 12% of the public supports Hamas. They have no money. They have no friends. Their backs are against the wall. Their tunnels are closed. The border with Egypt is closed. They have no support in the Arab world today, not from Qatar, not from Egypt. This is the opportune time for the Palestinian people to get rid of Hamas. because that's what they want. We can empower them to do that with a peace agreement. So, we have negotiations going on. We know what the issues are. We know what the solutions are. We know what the price that needs to be paid. We have a majority of people on both sides who are willing to pay it if they believe there's a partner on the other side. We have an Israeli prime minister who's the best person in Israel to negotiate this. There is no one better in Israel to negotiate peace with the Palestinians than Benjamin Netanyahu. It's the old Nixon-China thing. We say in Israel, you can't make war without the left, you can't make peace without the right. If Netanyahu makes the deal with the Palestinians, he takes 70% of the public with him, without an argument. He may lose his political party, but he has a majority in the Knesset. If there's a referendum, he'll get 65% at least support of a referendum. Mahmoud Abbas is the last of the founding fathers of the Palestinian national movement. There's no one better than him in Palestine to do this deal. He's unpopular and thought to be illegitimate today. The reason for his unpopularity and his illegitimacy is primarily because he's failed to deliver on the promise. He was elected with 68% of the vote on a ticket of peace, of ending the occupation and bringing his people peace, and he has failed to deliver. And he has lost the support of his people. But if he brings an agreement, he too will find an overwhelming majority behind him. All the stars are lined up. They're there, they're waiting. Netanyahu made a brilliant comment yesterday. I don't know if you noticed, if it was reported here in the news, when Francois Hollande, our newfound friend, the French people and their government, Netanyahu responding to Hollande's call on Israel to move forward with peace and the Palestinians, Netanyahu reached out and invited Mahmoud Abbas to come and speak to the Knesset and said that he would be willing to go to Ramallah to address the Palestinian people. I've been pushing this for months. I've been trying to get them. I've suggested it to the American team, and I've written it to Netanyahu and Abbas, and I'm not taking credit for doing it. It's a great idea, and there are lots of people who own great ideas. Of course, this is an opportunity. Just in case they actually take it, my Jerusalem Post column, which will appear on Thursday, is the speeches that they should give. So you can read it in advance of them giving it. This is a real opportunity because we need a breakthrough. We need a psychological dynamic that will change the attitudes of the people and empower the leaders to take the courageous steps that are necessary. This is not risk-free. There are lots of risks, but the risks of not doing it are much greater. We may not have an opportunity for years to do this again. If and when, God forbid, we go through another round of violence in which thousands of people are killed and billions of dollars of property damage is done, we will emerge from that situation just as we emerged from the Second Intifada, with no political achievements and the same issues on the negotiating table and the same solutions there. This is a conflict which is resolvable. The only solution to the conflict is a two-state solution. The agreement is on the table. We need the leaders to do it now. We need the support of people around the world to tell the leaders to do it, because again, the risks of not doing it are much higher, much higher. I'll say one thing for the Jewish people in this room. Israel, through the Zionist movement, was established to solve the Jewish problem. If Israel fails to make peace with the Palestinians, Israel will be the Jewish problem. This I assure you. We cannot sustain ourselves in a world today, whether we're right or we're wrong. The continued control of millions of people by a state who are not wanted there is not legitimate in the world today. And we can come up with every excuse in the world and paint the blackest picture of how evil these Palestinian people are. That continued control, the occupation of the Palestinian territories by Israel, is not sustainable. We have to do it, and we have to do it now. It's in our interest to do it. For the Palestinians, I will say, and if there are any Palestinians in the room or supporters of Palestinians, Palestinians deserve the same rights as any other people in the world for freedom and liberty and justice. They don't have to beg for it. It is their right. It is a right that we as Jews should recognize because we demanded the same right for ourselves. Making peace is right. It's right for Israel, it's right for the Palestinians, it's right for morality, it's right for what needs to be done in this world today. And if we don't do it, we'll just come back to it again later with a much worse situation on the ground. Thank you very much.
Open for discussion.
There's a microphone.
Be helpful for the videotaping if you can walk right up to the microphone to ask your question.
Check, 1, 2. Anyone, there's no such thing as a stupid question. There are only stupid answers. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Baskin. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Gershon.
Well, I'm Harpo. It's nice to meet you. You touched on at the end the role of world support, and I was wondering if you could explain a little more. How does world support actually affect this problem? Like, what is it that we or other people in the world can actually do to change the situation? I mean, I really appreciated the details you went into about the problems of the process, but it does make it seem like it's sort of out of our hands. So what do you think the role we have is?
I think it's very important for the American administration, and particularly your members of Congress, to know that there are voices in the communities here amongst their constituents who support the process that's going on, who believe that it's important for these negotiations to be successful, who understand that the United States has to play a crucial role both at the negotiating table and in providing the guarantees and the assurances that are going to have to come afterwards. And those are not only financial, but they will be financial as well. And not just American money, but the Americans are going to have to put it together. So it's important to know that your representatives in Washington hear your voice saying that you, as a Jew or a member of the community or their constituents, think that America has a role to play in assuring Israeli-Palestinian peace. And that means that Israel might have to be persuaded to make concessions that are difficult for it to make. And those concessions are in the national strategic interest of the Israeli people. Not only that, they're in the national strategic interest of the United States. And maybe that's more important for the members of Congress to hear as well. That was one of the statements that President Obama made in his second day in office in his first term, that the resolution of the Israeli-Arab conflict was a US national security interest. When he made that statement, I actually thought that he meant it. And that what he was saying was that if American lives are at risk because of the continuation of the Israeli-Arab conflict, then America has a job to do in resolving this conflict because it's American security interest. Unfortunately, the following day, Hillary Clinton came along with her old mantra that the parties have to want it more than us. And if the parties have to want it more than us, then we don't have to do anything. But I think that it is a national security interest of the United States of America, as it is of the Israeli people, and I would say the Jewish people as well. And I think it's important that the voices who oppose this are much louder than the voices who support it, particularly in Washington. And it's important to make sure that there's a majority of people in the community whose voices are heard louder than the opposition who don't want peace.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I like to dream too. If before the violence in Iraq, if before the violence in Egypt, if before the violence in Syria, if before the violence in Lebanon, if before the violence in Yemen,
We got it.
and all over, yeah. If before the violence between Hamas and Fatah, it might be possible to believe that a nonviolent solution or peace was part of an Arab cultural trait with the stability of those countries. But we now know that it isn't, if we didn't know that before, that peace and solving even family disputes without the use of violence is simply not part of the culture that Israel is facing in dealing with the enemies of Israel. And so therefore your dreams are wonderful if they could come about, but the fallacy of your present set of dreams in this environment is that there is no other party that wants to be in peace with Israel among the Arab groups. They just don't exist.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else?
First of all, thank you so much for coming, and also to Professor Jacobson for organizing this. You spoke to the fundamental importance of security in these negotiations, so I was wondering if you could address the tension between Israeli security and Palestinian sovereignty, particularly with regard to the proposal for a demilitarized Palestinian state.
In all the negotiations until now, including statements made most recently by Saeb Erekat, the chief Palestinian negotiator, Palestinians have accepted the idea of the proposal of a non-militarized Palestinian state. By the way, esoterically, they had, in previous negotiations, a 6-hour argument on semantics of whether or not it's a demilitarized state or a non-militarized state. They decided on non-militarized state. I'm not exactly clear what the differences are, but they agreed that the parameters of the kind of security forces that the Palestinians have would be decided by agreement. The kind of weapons that they would have would be decided by agreement. And of course, the nature of security cooperation would be determined by agreement. Israel maintains the position in the negotiations that there must be a long-term Israeli presence along the Jordan River. The reason for this, according to the Israeli claim, is that infiltration of rocket technology into the West Bank would be a strategic risk to the state of Israel. What does that mean? Because we face rocket fire from Gaza into Israel already since 2002. There have been rocket fire from Gaza into Israel. The difference is that rockets shot into Israel from Gaza are a nuisance, are unacceptable, intolerable, but they are not a strategic threat to the country. A rocket shot from the high points of Ramallah toward Ben Gurion Airport, from the Cultural Palace in Ramallah, the high point in Ramallah, you actually see the runway of Ben Gurion Airport. A rocket shot in that direction while a jet was coming in from the United States, even if the rocket doesn't come anywhere near the jet, ends civil aviation to the state of Israel. That's a strategic threat. So we must have in place mechanisms that will prevent the development of rocket technology in the West Bank, its infiltration from external borders, etc. Palestinians have said that they accept every single reasonable Israeli demand. They will accept at the end of the day, I believe, a mechanism for a bilateral Israeli-Palestinian force along the Jordan River. They will accept that Israel will continue to have flying rights over the entire Palestinian state, control of the skies. There will be Palestinian civil aviation agreements made, allowing them to have an airport and fly planes of their own, civilian airplanes that will be monitored by third parties to make sure they're not importing weapons and ammunition via their airport. There will be continuation of Israeli drones, surveillance drones flown over the West Bank and over the Jordan River. There will be the continuation of Israeli-Jordanian security cooperation, where the first line of defense are the Jordanian troops on the Jordanian side of the border. There will continue to be Israeli electronic surveillance along the Jordan River. I don't know if you know this, but we have actually surveillance equipment, listening equipment and cameras that observe today on monitor screens and rooms inside of Israel every single inch of that border, with the ability to push a button and have guns pop up from the ground and shoot anyone who might be walking by or threatening to breach that border. So there are ways of actually controlling the border without having physical presence there, and these kind of reasonable arrangements will be accepted within the framework of negotiations for an acceptable period of time. What I have proposed to the Israelis now and to the Americans, that we begin to create the mechanisms for true security cooperation in order to test the mechanisms before we withdraw from additional territory. What I mean is that Israel goes into Area A, goes into the Palestinian cities anytime it wants and arrests whoever it wants at any time of the day or night. We need to stop that. We can take one city at a time and test the Palestinians with providing them with intelligence information and seeing if they act on that intelligence information, to go and arrest wanted people, interrogate them, and if they find information which they would report to us that puts them in a position that when they were engaged in illegal activities of planning terrorist attacks, the Palestinians will be responsible for putting them on trial and incarcerating them. And if they don't, they fail the test, and then we know we can't make peace, so we can't move forward with withdrawals from territories. These mechanisms need to be in place because the most fundamental element of this agreement has to be the building of trust on the ultimate responsibility of ensuring that violence will not erupt. And by the way, don't believe what the previous spoker said about Arabs having an innate culture of hatred and violence. 250 million people who are Arabs, I think it's actually a lot more than that, are not the same, and bigoted, racist statements like that don't have a place in a university.
Cultural observation.
Thank you for your cultural observation. We heard it.
Yeah, I might point out.
No, you don't have the right to speak.
Extradition was the first part of the treaty that was ignored by the Arabs.
That's the last one.
Hi. Thank you so much for coming. I have a quick question about the Shalit deal, if you'd be willing to speak to that.
Sure.
A lot of Israelis at the time were concerned about the Palestinian prisoner release and were worried about future security threats.
So was I.
Have any of those, since the deal's been made, come to fruition? Have there been security threats, and how have those been addressed?
Israel released 1,027 prisoners for Gilad Shalit. The agreement was initially 1,000 prisoners, done in 2 phases, 450 in the first phase based on a list submitted by Hamas, 550 in a second list submitted by Israel and approved by the Egyptians. By the way, that deal was arranged in December of 2006, 6 months after Shalit was abducted. That was the agreement made 6 months after. It took another 5 years before it was implemented. Of the 450 who were released in, oh, by the way, the additional 27, this is a story that is just out of Twilight Zone. The agreement was that Israel would release all the Palestinian women prisoners. The day or 2 days before the implementation of the release, Israel discovered another 27 women prisoners in prison. I don't know how you lose 27 prisoners, but they were discovered 2 days before the release, and then they were simply added to the list because the obligation was made that we would release all the women. Much of the work that I did in the negotiations, being guided by a senior Mossad officer, was aimed at mitigating the risks. Because what sense does it make to release one Israeli soldier knowing that tens or hundreds more would be killed as a result of the release? So the fine-tuning of the deal was aimed at mitigating, of lessening the risks in the deal, and what was done was that the first list of names that Hamas gave that Israel had, the officials, the security people responsible for the security had determined were too risky to release were removed from the list. That was one of my personal achievements in convincing them that if they kept those names in the list, there would be no deal. So they were removed. The second group of names was based on a list of 50 names that Hamas had submitted, that at the end of the day, based on this idea that we would put down all our cards and we would shoot for the middle, it was a list of 50 names. It was agreed that Israel would pick 25 names from the 50, and Hamas agreed that all of them would be deported forever. So those people were considered high risk, were deported. They're under the watchful eyes of intelligence services in the countries where they are, reporting back to Israel as well. The third group who were deemed as being risky were West Bankers, who Israel wanted almost all of them to be sent to the Gaza Strip. In the end of the day, the Palestinians agreed that 50% minus 1 would be sent to Gaza and the rest would be sent to the West Bank. Those who were sent to the West Bank were put under probation regimes, having to report to local Palestinian police headquarters on a regular basis, each one determined on the number of times per week, and some of them were given physical limitations of where they can move and where they cannot move. Since the agreement was implemented, by the way, more than 400 of the first 450 had killed Israelis. So we're talking about people who were not nice people. Since the deal was done more than 2 years ago, none of them have returned to terrorism. About 15 of them have been rearrested on probation violations. Most of those have been re-released. So thank God, until now, there haven't been. One thing that's never spoken about, I've spoken about it, also in the Arab media, is that they paid a very heavy price for holding an Israeli soldier. During the 5 years and 4 months that Gilad Shalit was in captivity, more than 3,000 Gazans were killed. Their whole economy was destroyed. They were put under siege. They were closed off from the world. The Palestinian leaders from Hamas are well aware of the price that they paid, and it's not by chance that they haven't kidnapped another soldier in the last 2 years. They certainly had motivation based on the results of the prisoner release, but they know what the costs were as well.
First, I'd just like to say how deeply appreciative I am of the work you're doing,
Thank you.
how urgent I think it is. I was curious when you talked about two things. First, you talked about Obama not being seen as weak in the Middle East, and I wish you would explicate that a little bit. Why? Is it because he can't get anything done at home, or is it because of what's happening there? I guess the other thing is, do you have evidence that he isn't behind what Kerry is doing, or that he is?
I think the perception of Obama's weakness in the region is perhaps started throughout the Arab Spring, particularly with regard to Egypt. There was a floundering back and forth on the American position. Do we support Mubarak? Don't we support Mubarak? Is he our friend? Is he not our friend? Do we support the young people in the square? Don't we support the young people in the square? Afterwards, Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood were elected. We support the Muslim Brotherhood because they were elected democratically, but who are they? What do they stand for? And then when there was the Tamarut, demonstrations against Morsi and the army threw him out, the administration didn't come strongly behind the Egyptian people and the army in support of a non-Islamic rule, and again, floundered back and forth. Similarly, there has been no American position on the disaster of Syria. 130,000 people killed by the regime, and America, as the leader of the free world, does nothing. Question is, do we arm the opposition? Don't we arm the opposition? Do we give them money? Do we give them weapons? No determined policy on what is clearly a human disaster of proportions that demand an American response, and it's not there. There was perceived in the whole chemical weapons adventure another sign of American weakness. I don't agree on this point. I actually think that there was a major victory for diplomacy on the chemical weapons side, and I was very supportive of the Russian move that basically forced America not to attack Syria. Most Israelis perceive that as another sign of American weakness, that he was too scared to pull the trigger. In this case, I was definitely happy that he didn't pull the trigger. And again, we see what's happening with Iran and what appears to be America backing down on demands that were made in the past vis-a-vis Iran, and having the French step in to toe the hard line on the Iranian issue, again perceived as American weakness. Now, it's not only Israel which perceives the American weakness, it's also the other enemies of Iran in the Gulf states, the Sunni Arab countries, who are allies of the United States, the Qataris and the Saudis and the Emirates, who want a hard line against Iran and don't see it coming from the United States. So that's where it's perceived. Also, America doesn't have the financial might that it had in the past, and that's very clear. Does Obama support Kerry? I believe he does. We don't hear his voice very much. Kerry is seen as being the leader on this. He convinced Obama to let him go with it, and he's moving with it. If he's successful, he'll have the full support of the president.
Wait for the last question.
Okay.
Hi. Could you just comment about the effect of these new settlements and how they should proceed?
Yeah. We need a border. We need an accepted border between us and the Palestinians so that everyone knows that what we build is legitimate and where we build is ours. And until we have an agreed border between us and the Palestinians, every new house that's built in territories which is considered occupied territories, it's a in-their-face move against the chances of peace. The number of settlers in the territories since the beginning of the peace process has more than doubled. This is land that we're supposed to be giving over to the Palestinians for their state. So it's a message to the Palestinians that we're not serious about doing it. And it's an obstacle to peace because they also have a constituency. They also have to go back to their people and say, we're negotiating while Israel is building. And from the Palestinian street perspective, the Palestinian people's perspective, they see Israel's willingness to negotiate. The saying in Palestine is that Israel wants to negotiate forever. The ideal situation, Israel negotiates, and builds more settlements. And that's the reality on the ground. And the likelihood of a Palestinian state, in their viewpoint, seems less and less real. So this is the danger of the settlements. I will also say that according to international law, with the exception of very few serious international lawyers, there's no question that the building of settlements is illegal by international law. These territories, whether we like it or not, are considered a belligerent occupation by the Fourth Geneva Convention. And it is illegal by international law to transfer civilian population into occupied territories. You can build military camps there. You can't move civilians there. And it is illegal by international law. Every single settlement, including the ones in Jerusalem, those settlements that we call neighborhoods, like Ramat Eshkol and French Hill and Gilo and Pisgat Ze'ev, those are settlements too, and they're illegal by international law. And I actually think it's quite magnanimous of the Palestinians that they're saying that they're willing to accept the idea of territorial swaps, because they could also maintain the position based on international law that every single settlement is illegal and they have to be removed. That's not realistic. And the Palestinians are much more realistic than that, and they're willing to accept the violation of international law in order to achieve peace. But we should at least be honest with ourselves. At least that, we should be honest with ourselves and recognize that what we're doing is in violation of international law, even if it is part of the land of Israel and part of our heritage. There are still rules of the game in the international community that we should be playing by. And if we're not playing by them, then let's at least be honest with ourselves that we're not playing by them. Thank you.